So today we're going to talk about the records that we hold here at New South Wales State Archives about private hospitals. But first I would like to acknowledge country. In the spirit of reconciliation, New South Wales State Archive acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connection to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. So today we're going to talk about what a private hospital actually is, answer the burning question of whether or not we hold patient records from private hospitals, talk about the records that we do actually hold here, and then look at different aspects of the hospital, such as a building, the business and the nurses. We're also going to look at some sources for big picture information, such as legislation, regulations, statistics, and annual reports. So basically, a private hospital is a non-government hospital, and it doesn't come under the Public Hospitals Act. Now, the government doesn't start regulating private hospitals until 1910, and remembering, of course, that we hold the records of the state government. We don't hold private records. So there were private hospitals that existed before the Act, but there was generally no government involvement in licensing them, and therefore no licensing records. So the Private Hospital Act is 1908, and the first regulations under that Act came into effect on the 1st of October 1909. There are different types of private hospital. There's the medical surgical private hospital. There's the lying in, which we'd probably better know as a maternity hospital. And some private hospitals were both medical, surgical and lying in. A lot of these hospitals are very, very small. In 1910, the first year of licensing, of the 405 private hospitals, the majority only had 2 beds. And it was only in Sydney that you had 14 private hospitals that had more than 20 beds. By 1915, there were private hospitals throughout 165 country towns, so there was a good spread throughout New South Wales. But again, the majority are only 1 to 3 beds, and there were 519 private hospitals in total in 1915. But again, only 20 of those actually had more than 20 beds, and 19 of these were in Sydney, and 1 was at Richmond. So the prime period where private hospitals seem to, we still have private hospitals today, obviously, but the prime numbers of private hospitals covered that time period 1910 to the 1950s. Just a reminder that in fact, it wasn't until the 1998 State Records Act that public hospital records were required as state archives. So that's very recent, only about 24 years ago. And in fact, not many public hospitals have transferred any patient records to us. And keeping in mind that all patient identifying records, whether they're in asylums, mental hospitals or public hospitals, are closed to public access for 110 years. So this is just a graph that I've taken out of the information from the yearbooks, the statistical registers and the annual reports, just to give some idea of the numbers of private hospitals, but also the way in which the numbers declined really from the 30s, the 40s onwards. And also the ratio, the proportion that were lying in, which was initially much, much higher than the medical surgical, how those proportions change as well. Now, this is our most frequent question regarding private hospitals, and that is, do we hold the patient records of private hospitals? And the answer is that we don't. And people are often seeking these records for a variety of reasons, but usually because they want to get further information that's not showing up on a birth or death certificate, such as the father's name, the time of birth, for a death, more information about the deceased's wife and family or their parents, and so on and so forth. Now, there was legislation, the keeping of records by private hospitals was covered by legislation, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But these records were from individual businesses, small businesses, if you like, and they don't appear to have survived. So I spoke to Dr. Nolene Kyle while I was preparing this webinar, and she spent decades researching the history of midwives and private hospitals. she has only found the business records of one private hospital. And those records did not include personal information of patients. They only included the number of births per week. So larger private hospitals, they're often run by charitable or religious organisations. They run for longer time periods than these small hospitals run by individuals. And their records may have survived if they were held by a parent organisation. So if you're looking for records of a large private hospital, I would suggest looking at Find and Connect website. And we'll go on to talk about that in a minute. But first I want to actually look in greater detail than I normally do at the legislation, because it really said what kind of records the hospital had to keep. Even if these records haven't survived, it's still interesting to know the kind of records they had to keep. So the Private Hospitals Act in 1908 said you had to report infectious diseases to the Board of Health within 24 hours, certain infectious diseases, ones that were notifiable diseases. A private hospital also had to report births and deaths to the local registrar of births, deaths and marriages within 24 hours of the event. They did have to keep registers of patients, and we'll go on to look at the Form 17 in a minute. And there was a £100 fine if the register of patients contained untrue information. Now that's a huge amount of money in 1908. I know if we convert it into decimal, it's 200, but if you think about what the buying power of £100 was in those days, it's a large amount of money. And lastly, the hospital and the register had to be open at all times to inspection by the Board of Health or its representative. So basically they could knock on the door of a private hospital and say, I want to come in and inspect and I want to see your register. So what kind of information did a private hospital have to keep about a birth? Very limited, really. It's the name of the patient, so the mother, what her address was, and whether or not the baby was male or female, and when the patient actually entered the hospital. And here we have a single surviving form that was found pasted into a book, and I have never seen another one of these in all our entire collection. So I'm calling it a single survivor. Now you'll notice there is no information being given by the hospital to the district registrar about who the father is, or even the baby's name, or the time the baby was born. That wasn't required to be reported by the hospital. So Form 16 was the report of deaths. And again, you get the fact that where the hospital is, when the person died, their name, and where they last resided, where they last lived, and the date they went into the hospital. Again, there is no ability for the hospital to record, or the hospital doesn't have to record parents' names, children's names, where they were born, how long they've been in the country, all that style of information that we sometimes find missing from a death certificate. And finally, Form 17 for the Register of Patients. So the Act specified exactly what they had to keep: name, age, sex, married or single, where they usually lived, when they came into the hospital, date and time, if a doctor saw them, date of leaving or date and time of death, disease, were any operations performed, who did the operations, and if it was a birth, the date of the birth, the sex of the infant, and the condition of the infant at the time of delivery and during its stay in hospital. So again, very limited personal information, more about the nature of why they were in hospital rather than who they are. Now, we do have one series which is called Notifications of Births, Deaths and Notifiable Infectious Diseases in Private Hospitals. Don't get your hopes up. This is statistics only, as you can see by a couple of sample pages. I'm not certain whether the scarlet fever listing there, whether the name in the column after the date is the family name of the patient. I don't know. That would require some further investigation. But as you can see, it's not really a list of births, deaths. It's just purely statistics. Rightio, so we're going to come back to Find and Connect. Find and Connect is a website set up by the federal government to help those who are trying to find information about their own history in child in care, but it is also useful for other reasons. It includes information about homes. It includes information about the records that have survived about the homes. So here we have the Belhaven Home for Mothers and Babies, set up by a businessman, Mr. L.O. Bailey, to test his health benefits of his natural health approach to diet and medicine. And unfortunately, as you can see, there are no records that Find and Connect have been able to find out about this home, but it does give you a source of the information they've used to create this history of it, such as theses, reports, books, and online resources. So it can be useful sort of background information for what you're after. And here is the list of the New South Wales hospitals that they have entries on, and the New South Wales lying-in homes. And those maternity homes tend to be the large organisational religious homes rather than the 1 or 2 bed private hospitals. And I just thought I'd throw in the Sydney Benevolent Asylum, the information that's up on Find and Connect for it, plus of course the fact that there is that index to admissions and discharges from 1857 to 1900 on the internet, which you can access and find out entries, and also records after 1901 can be accessed via the Benevolent Society, held at the State Library, but you need a letter of permission from the Benevolent Society to access them. So what records do we actually hold here at New South Wales State Archives about private hospitals? Mainly it's the licences, and it's also the minutes of the proceedings of the Board of Health. And there are also returned licences in the records of the Colonial Secretary, Chief Secretary. So let's have a look at the Register of Licensed Private Hospitals. It runs from 1910 to 1928, gives you basic information, the name, location, the type, number of beds, names of the licensee, etc., time period, the board's recommendation. There is space provided for correspondence and case numbers, but we do not hold that correspondence or those case papers or the applications. So unfortunately, the registers is what we hold. So now we'll look at some examples of these. So this is an entry for Belmore, which is a lying-in hospital at the corner of Marsh and Brown Streets in Armidale. 5 patients, doesn't run for very long. It starts up in 1910, it's discontinued 1913. Here we have Balmoral in Taylor Street, Armidale. Again, it's a maternity hospital, 2 beds. Starts up in 1911 by Ellen New, discontinued 1919, but then starts up again in 1920, and again is discontinued in 1922. So I don't know what happened there. This is the Hillgrove Cottage Hospital, only from 1918 to 1922, and it's being run by the Bush Nursing Association. Here we have Kyola at South Armidale. It's a maternity, surgical and lying-in hospital. Hillgrove Hospital had 9 beds. It was also medical, surgical and lying-in, and Kyola has 14 beds. Now, Kyola is a partnership between Minnie Watt and Alice Burke, but obviously something happens to the partnership, and from 1917 onwards, it's only Minnie Webb. And there's a nice little notation there which says that there's been a case in the Equity Court in September 1917, and the partnership has dissolved. So it's still running in 1920, but then it's discontinued. I think one of the things that struck me by looking through these registers is how small a lot of these hospitals are and what short time periods they run for. Now here we have the Hospital of Janet Bray in High Street, Waratah in Newcastle. It's a maternity hospital and has 2 beds. It starts up in 1917 and is still going in 1927. And here it's not just small hospitals, because here we have the Mater Hospital at Waratah, also in Newcastle, and it is only medical and surgery. There's no lying-in, no maternity facilities. Has 30 beds, starts up in 1922 and is still running in 1927. Here we have the Haven, which is in Northcote Street, Aberdare, which is near Cessnock. It's a maternity hospital, again 2 beds, and it runs from 1917 and is discontinued 1921. I've circled in the dark bluey colour the remarks, which is 6/12, which stands for 6 months. So Mary Ashton had 6 months training at the South Sydney Women's Hospital, and ATNA means she is a member of the Australian Trained Nurses Association. Here we have an entry for Sturry in Jessie Street, Armidale. It's a medical surgery and a maternity hospital and has 12 beds. It starts up in 26, still going in 27, and we have this notation on it, which makes us weep, which says for subsequent entries, see cards. We do not hold those cards, unfortunately. Now, as well as the hospitals that were approved, there is often in the backs of the volumes loose pages telling you the hospitals that were refused. So here, for example, we have Mrs. W. Austin, Mrs. William Austin of Armidale, better known as Mary Jane. She has applied in 1918 for a lying-in hospital, and it has been refused. Now, in 1927, she does get permission for her house at 143 Markham Street, Armidale, to become a maternity hospital. And this is because the Nurses Registration Act of 1924 came along. The manager of a private hospital from 1908 had to be a registered nurse. There are contemporary indexes to these registers of private hospitals. Some of them are a bit hit and miss, but there is also an index created by Teapot Genealogy that is available in book form or also on CD-ROM, and it's indexed by place, hospital name, manager's name, assistant manager's name, and so on and so forth. So that actually takes a lot of the guesswork, particularly if you're looking for a property and you're not quite certain of who actually ran the property or anything like that, or if you're doing a local history. So now we come to the minutes of the proceedings of the Board of Health, and it has similar information to that of the registers for licensed hospitals, just saying that it's been approved, but it's also a good source of information for rejected applications and for prosecutions against those who breached the Act by running unlicensed private hospitals. You don't get a huge amount of detail in the minutes. The fact that for example, Mrs. M.J. Sloggett, Mary James Sloggett of Markham Street, Armidale, there has been a breach of the Act by her. It's been reported by the police, so there's a police report come to the board, and then the board has discussed it and decided that she should be prosecuted. So you get more information in the local papers, where we get told the name of couple of the patients, and that they had both had their children at her home, and the magistrate decided to impose the minimum penalty of £10 as the defendant had borne a good character. And he also says that if application was made for remission of part of the penalty, he would endorse that. So you do also get references into the minutes of people who are saying, I've been fined this amount, can we get that amount cut down? And the board does sometimes agree to that. On the same date as meeting about Mary Jane, we get a breach of the Act by Mrs. J. Brigden of Herbert Street, Golgong, and Mr. or Mrs. James Ryan, in collusion with Mrs. Lonnie Ryan, also of Herbert Street, Golgong. And again, you get a report by the police, referenced, and a memorandum by the Principal Assistant Medical Officer of the government. And the board decided for prosecution. So again, it may be a matter of going to the newspapers and seeing what actually happened. Now, Mary Jane Sloggett was born in 1861. She had been supporting her family of 6 children since her first husband took ill in 1905. This is a letter in the Chief Secretary's in letters, where the police are reporting on a recommendation by the doctor that the government pay for Herbert to actually come to Sydney to get medical assistance. And the police report, there's also a medical certificate in this file, and the police report that Sloggett is without means. His wife is dressmaking, and that is the sole means of support for the family, which consists of 6 children. 1 boy is working, but only gets small wages, which is used to assist to keep the children. He also reports that local residents are subscribing some money, which they intend giving Sloggett for the purpose of seeing a doctor if he can get to Sydney. He did, in fact, go to a hospital in Sydney where he died in 1908. In 1912, as we saw in the court case, she's working as a midwife. She married William Austin in 1913, but she continued throughout her life to work as a midwife, only retiring in 1940 when she would have been 79. Now, she applied unsuccessfully in 1918 for a private hospital licence, and this shows up in the minute. And the board decided that it is not prepared to recommend that her premises be licensed, nor to approve her as resident manager. And the main reason I would suggest is that, in fact, the Act required that the resident manager be a nurse, a registered nurse, which she wasn't. Now, you could have exceptions to this, such as very, very remote areas. You didn't have to be a resident to be a registered nurse. But even in remote areas, if somebody, even if you'd kept a hospital for 10 years, if somebody who was a registered nurse moved into the area and applied to get a hospital, they would get it and you wouldn't, you'd be kicked out. Mary Jane was finally able to register as a nurse in 1926 under the Nurses Registration Act of 1924, and we'll talk about that in a minute. There was another court case which actually doesn't show up in the Board of Minutes, and what the arguments are about is how many births a midwife could have at her house. There was no problem if you were a midwife, you didn't have to be trained. You could actually go out and help people have children in their houses. But if people came to your house to have a child, then there was a limit on how many of those you could have per year. And if you went over the limit, then you were regarded as having an unlicensed private hospital. So here we have the evidence of Ellen Foran, and basically she said she had always planned to have her baby at home. About 2 a.m. on the 1st of June, she suddenly took ill. I guess that means that basically she went into labour. So she then went to Mary Jane's house. I don't know how far she had to walk to get the nurse to come back to her house with her. While the nurse was getting dressed, she, the witness, became much worse. I would assume it means that she went into labour more heavily and couldn't leave the house. The doctor was sent for. Now, Ellen says that she would have returned home if she could because she had left a house full of young children, 8 in number, with no one else in the house with them. Presumably the husband was at work or not around. And she had previously arranged with the nurse to come to her house rather than go and have her baby at Mary Jane's house. Mary Jane's lawyer in defence said that the defendant had only had 12 births in her house in the last 12 years, and that was well within the statutory limit for an unlicensed hospital. But the magistrate fined her £15 or 3 months jail with a week allowed to pay. So then you have this notice in the newspapers, the Armidale Express, where she actually thanks the husbands of her patients who assisted her to pay the fine. And here we have a photo of her with 4 of her grandchildren, 2 sets of twins that she actually delivered within about, I think it was a fortnight of each other. This issue also affected boarding houses because a lot of country women, when they were coming close to birth time, would come into the large town to stay so that they would be able to access a doctor. So there were questions raised in these minutes also about when a boarding house became an unlicensed hospital and how many births a boarding house could have because the women had come to town to have these children. Also, we have the returned licenses of many of these private hospitals, both within the main series of letters of the Chief Secretary and also in the special bundles. They include a list of which licenses there are, and they include the original licenses. This is because as part of the process of renewal, the old licenses had to be returned, and even if the license was not renewed, the old license still had to be handed back. So now we're going to look at the records of private hospitals as businesses, and these are the same records for any business, and you may have seen some of these in our Business and Company Records Guide, such as the Register of Firms, the company's packets, the rules of and articles of association, and of course you also get information about businesses when things go wrong, in the insolvency files and the bankruptcy files. So the Register of Firms is an interesting one because there are lots of references to private hospitals in these. They give information such as the name of the firm, nature of the business, dates, and the names of the people carrying on the business. They also give what are called packet and statement numbers, and these have not survived. New South Wales State Archives only holds the registers. The other thing I want to emphasise is the fact that it's not a list of all firms that existed. It's actually only the ones whose names obscured who actually ran the firm. So not finding your business in the Register of Firms doesn't mean that there wasn't a business. If your name was John Smith Blacksmith, you did not have to be registered under the Register of Firms. If your name was the Good Blacksmith Company, you had to be registered so that people could actually find out who ran that firm. Now you can access this index either through our collection search through the main page of the website, or you can go into the online indexes. And the advantage of going into the online indexes is that you can then download your information as an Excel or a CSV file and play around with it on your own computer. So here we have here we have where I've looked at the private hospitals as a keyword and downloaded it into Excel. And remembering, of course, that keyword isn't always your friend. So, for example, amongst the entries for private hospital, we have the Doris Dolls Hospital, we have the Clothes Hospital. My favourite is the American Shirt Hospital, run by the American Shirt and Repairing Company. So again, keyword isn't necessarily the same as subject heading. And here we have some examples from the Register of Firms. So information about who's running it, where it's situated, the date of registration, and who's involved in it. And occasionally you get additional information such as change of firm name. For the Mrs. Steele and Hay, they changed the name for the firm to Claremore. There aren't a huge number of hospital entries for the company's packet, only about 26. And again, you get the Griffith Tyre Hospital. So not a huge number of private hospitals were companies, but occasionally you can get a company packet for them. And the Articles of Association, again, there's only 4 entries that actually bring up hospital. 1 for the Scottish Hospital, 2 for the Richmond and District Hospital, and the last one is actually a hospital benefits company. So again, most of these things are not companies. Most of these private hospitals are not companies. They're just run by individuals. And therefore you do actually get entries in the insolvencies and the bankruptcies. I initially tried hospital as keyword first and found interesting entries such as people who were patients of hospitals going bankrupt or people who are hospital attendants. But then when I used the keyword nurse, that's when the entries came up. And you get the name of the person, their occupation, their place, the date of sequestration, the file number, and our reference. I also decided to see if there was any comparison if nurses were going bankrupt, were doctors going bankrupt as well. So again, when I used doctor, it was remarkable how few entries I got in the index. Musical doctor, corn doctor, Chinese doctor, Indian doctor, but only 1, 2, 3, 4 who had doctor of medicine. But the keyword to use was in fact medical practitioners. Again, you've got to use the contemporary words rather than the words we're used to. And there were quite a few of doctors who also went bankrupt. So here we have some examples from the bankruptcies. This is Mary and Jessie Hannaford, and there's a huge amount of information in this one. So she's actually telling you where she previously worked and the fact that she was matron at Young, Newcastle, Bathurst, Glen Innes. She also worked at 2 grammar schools, one in Queensland and one in Sydney. And she also was a sister at Kalgoorlie Fremantle Hospitals in Western Australia, and she had done private nursing in New South Wales, South Africa, and England. In 1916, she decided to set up a private hospital at Elizabeth Bay Road, and she was told she would have support by a number of doctors. So it gives you details of how much money she actually spent. The property she decided on was actually a boarding house, and she had to buy the business out And then she had to obtain a 15-year lease. So she spent $800 buying it out, $500 per year leasing it, which is a huge amount of money. Then she had to add an operating theatre, install electric lights, a fire escape, iron pipe, water pipes instead of lead ones, and so on and so forth with the hospital opening. And she didn't receive as many patients as she expected. And one of the doctors who'd promised to support her, send patients to her, had actually gone away to the war as well. But you also get the evidence of the neighbour, Dr. Ralph Worrell, who, when he heard that she was setting up a hospital, rang her up and said, "I wish to ring you up in a friendly way and warn you that I entirely object to a hospital coming next door to me, so close as this must be. Not only will it depreciate my property, which I do not intend to sell, but noise at night, bells, patients, and vomiting may disturb my rest, which is essential to me carrying on my work." And he details how he's planning to go to court. And if that doesn't work, he'll build a high wall, which will also block out her light and air, and so on and so forth. But he also says that he went to the Board of Health and they took no notice of his protests. Here we have another bankruptcy. This is Lillian Agnes Bellamy, and she's better known by her stepfather's name of Fawcett. And it mentions that she started business in Cooma in July 1917. And there was a court case in June 1918, and that's why she's now become bankrupt, because she has to pay over £200 because of injuries, £284, sorry, because of injuries to Jean Beale. And she also states that the injuries were caused by the carelessness of a nurse employed by her who had charge of the said Jean Beale at the time of the accident. And that in fact, Lillian had not been present at the hospital when the injuries occurred. And the injuries were in fact the scalding of a newborn baby from a hot water bottle. The water escaped and scalded the child on the side of the face, ear, arm, and chest. And here we have a letter within the bankruptcy file from the father, John Bales. I think I've got a typo there, my apologies, complaining about the fact that they're planning to release Nurse Bellamy from bankruptcy, but he has not in fact received any money from her. So I just want to look at some other sources that you could use to look for a business, including private hospitals. Telephone directories, now they're up on Trove magazines and newsletter section for Sydney. SANS directories, I think we're probably all fairly familiar with. They're on Ancestry and City of Sydney archives. A couple also on Trove magazines and newsletters that you may not be as familiar with. Wise's Post Office directories and Dunn's Gazette. And both of these actually go for 20 to 30 years after SANS stops. So it's interesting information for that 1930s, 40s, 50s period. So these are pages from Wise's Post Office directory. The first one is the Trades directory, which is under the heading of Medical Private Hospitals for 1943. And you can see them all listed there. And then you've got suburban directories, and this is the listing of hospitals-private for Parramatta for 1950. And we've still got two, Inch Nuke, I guess, in George Street, and Aloha in Phillip Street. Dunn's is the most interesting publication because it's full of business news, the kind of news they thought people in business wanted to know. So you've got business changes, you've got new businesses, you've got registered firms, you've got bankruptcies listed, you've got information about publican's license and changes of publican's licenses, a lot of interesting information. So in 1928, for example, we learned that Olive McIntosh and Linda May Oldfield, who are trading as the Dalcross Private Hospital at Killara, have dissolved their partnership, and that Olive McIntosh is continuing the business and assumes all liabilities. And in the 1942 registered firms, we've got a number of private hospitals starting up. The Branxton Private Hospital, which is at Ashfield. The Brooklyn Private Hospital is at Cogra, and you get the name of the matron. The Fairholme Private Hospital, which is at Singleton. And the Braywood Private Hospital, which is at Petersham. Another aspect of private hospitals, of course, is the building that they were set up in. So again, similar information is available in our house and property guide on our website. And I'm going to look at two particular records, the valuation cards and rolls, and the deceased estate files. So here we have a valuation roll for the Newcastle area for Hamilton, and it's for the Gowan Bray Private Hospital in Samden Street. And it provides information such as the owners, where they're living, the land title details, which would then allow you to go into the Historic Land Record Viewer to have a look at that information, the dates of the valuations, the amounts of the valuations, the unimproved, which is just the land, the improved, which is land and buildings. And interestingly, it says that it's a private hospital in the 1939 to 61 page. And it also lets us know that the private hospital's name has changed. It's now Gowan Bray, but it was Mullumbimba. And of course, it gives you a description of the buildings, 2-story brick on brick house, part brick on stone, 19 rooms, kitchen and outhouse, slate roof. And there's a couple of rooms and a laundry, which have weatherboard and have an iron roof. And I'm working backwards in time because this is the best way to research these records. So the listing for 1926 to 1935 for Hamilton local government area has Mullumbimba Private Hospital, and private hospital is actually written in by hand. It covers the time period 26 to 38. And again, it tells us that in 1930 there was the addition of the weatherboard shed, and in 1938 there were other additions. Now, this Mullumbimba or Gowan Bray does not show up in the registers of licenses, so I kind of have to assume that it's probably licensed in the 1930s rather than the 1920s. And of course, here we have the valuation card for Hamilton covering the time period 1921 to 24. And again, it still has the name Mullumbimba, but there is no mention of it being a private hospital. Now, the deceased estate files, which are, of course, the valuation of the estate for the payment of stamp duty to the government, if you like a death or inheritance tax, contains information on what the people own. And we find that Catherine Moore, who was a nurse at Armidale and died in 1927, is still owed a debt of £75 by Isabel Gillett for the sale of some property, lot 16 of section 32 in the town of Armidale. And she's already paid $1,100 in cash, but she still owes the £75. And if we go to the private hospitals register, we see that this is previously known as Rothley and has its name changed later to Winona. And in fact, it was set up by Catherine Moore in 1910, but in 1918 it transfers to Isabel Gillett. And it's still in operation in 1928, and also says for subsequent entries see card, so it's continuing after 1928. But you'd have to probably go looking in the land records to see when Isabel Gillett actually purchased it, because she's taking it over in 1918, but this is suggesting to me that she didn't purchase it until roughly 27 perhaps, maybe a little bit earlier. Here we have a deceased estate for Isabel Charlotte Walsh. And this is interesting because it's about the partnership that she had with her sister, who is Hilda Eveline Welsh. And it talks about Lucian Private Hospital, Turnbridge Street, Mascot. They were in equal partnership. They purchased the business in 1934 from the late Gertrude May Blake for £150. That money was actually loaned to the partners by Hilda's husband, Lyndon Welsh. And they also were paying for the lease of the premises that had previously also belonged to Gertrude May Blake, the late Gertrude May Blake. So if you're interested in that particular building, you'd probably then want to have a look at Gertrude May Blake's deceased estate if she has one. Another aspect of the private hospital is obviously the nurses. We have registers of nurses, general nurses, midwives, infant nurses, and psychiatric nurses. They all start at 1926 and run to 1954. There are also the minute books of the Nurses Registration Board, and the indexes of the registers, the registers are indexed on our website and also on Ancestry, and the minute books are indexed on Ancestry. And again, there is a nurse's guide on our website. So here we have a page from the Register of Midwives. And what I want to bring your attention to, it obviously has the person's name, it has the certificate number, their record number. has the dates of registration or renewal, but I want to particularly emphasise the remarks because this is often a question we get. What does that mean? And this actually tells you what part of the Act the person is registered under. So, for example, if we follow the red arrow, then Grace Annie Allmiller is registered under Section 10.3. And Section 10.3 says that she is a member of any nursing association approved by the board. So the association has looked into her training and said, yes, you can be a member. Now, Lockhart Agnes Gould is registered under 10.1. She holds an appropriate certificate as required by Section 9 and satisfies the board that she has been shown proficiency in the particular branch in which she applies to be registered in. Mary Jane Austin is registered under Section 10.2, and she has had to produce to the board certificates of competency from 2 doctors, so 2 doctors have had to vouch for her, and other evidence to show that she has in fact possesses a satisfactory knowledge of nursing and has been at least nursing for at least 3 years. So she had to basically show that she had been nursing previously, show that she had knowledge, and have 2 doctors support her. And that's why she was able to get registered. The Act also required that the Board of Health publish lists of nurses in the New South Wales Government Gazette. And there are these lists showing up in the Government Gazettes on Trove. The lists cover the time period 1926 to 1940, and they're published from 1927 to 1941. They're divided up by the type. So here we have the midwifery nurses, and we can see on the bottom page that Janet Matilda Bray is at 15 High Street, Waratah in 1927. Now these big lists of names, and there are a lot of lists of names in the Government Gazette, basically stopped during World War II because of the shortage of labour, ink and paper, and they don't restart again after World War II, unfortunately, but you can get them from Trove. So here we have information on Janet Bray, and what I find interesting is the fact that the newspaper article talks about her celebrating her 50th anniversary as a nurse. She's assisted in 4,000 births during those 50 years, and she trained at the South Sydney Women's Hospital and received her certificate on the 1st of August 1898. She doesn't actually get registered until 1927. As I said, you did not have to be registered to be a midwife. And here we also have a copy of one of her returned licenses, which is a 1925 license. The licenses don't give you a huge amount of information, but they're nice to see. So I just want to mention some of the sources for the background information that I've used here today: the legislation, the regulations, the statistics, and the public health annual reports. So the legislation is available in the As Made section of the legislation website, and current legislation is also there available, which has changed constantly, but the historical information, you want the As Made section. There we have a list of those private hospital acts. Now, the regulations are published in the New South Wales Gazette, and again, those gazettes are available on Trove in the newspaper and gazette section. The regulations tend to nut out the nitty-gritty of how things are going to operate. So, for example, the first regulations are talking heavily about the fact that they don't want cross-infection. So you can't have a person staying in a house, in a room, waiting a childbirth with somebody else who's got an infectious disease. If you in fact get childbirth fever in the hospital, you can't have any new patients until permission's given by the President of the Board of Health. The surfaces of the room, the walls, the partitions, the ceilings, have to be able to be disinfected. So they have to be paint, cement, plaster, lime wash, or sanitary paper that will let them be disinfected. If you have infectious diseases, you have to completely disinfect the room and you have to notify the Secretary of the Board of Health within 48 hours. And you can't have more than the number or class of patients that you're entitled to in the private hospital at any one time. So very much nitty-gritty of how the thing will operate. Statistics have come from the Official Yearbook of New South Wales, which is also a good place to get plainer English explanation of legislation. The New South Wales Statistical Registers, which have lots and lots of stats, And of course, the annual reports of the Director General of Public Health. Those annual reports are published in the New South Wales Parliamentary Papers, pre-1900, which is, we're talking post-1909 here, but pre-1900, they're on the New South Wales Parliament website. And post-1900, we have copies here. New South Wales State Library has copies. They may also be available at large university libraries as well. So here we have the 1931-32 report of the Director General of Public Health, which includes a section under the Private Hospitals Act, talks about the numbers of them, talks about the fact that they have departmental supervisory nurses who go into these places and inspect them, both in Sydney and the country districts, and how much that has made the hospitals better, and also the fact that the resident managers like to be able to talk to an inspecting nurse to get advice from them. Also talks about community activities, such as the Ku-ring-gai Community Service Hospital at Chatswood, the Red Cross Society has a hospital at Hay, a Masonic hospital is opened up at Ashfield. It talks about the Bush Nursing Association and the Country Women's Association and the hospitals that they're running. It talks about the exemption, so a hospital that didn't have to have a registered nurse. There's only one in 1931-32, and that's at Rye Park. And it talks about legislation, the effect of legislation on the hospitals. It also includes statistics and graphs. And I've included this as just not an example of the kind of graphs they have, but I also thought it was an interesting comparison, because all of the legislation and all of the work that the Board of Health is doing has obviously cut down infant mortality in New South Wales from 1875 to 1932. So that's the one on the right. That's per the annual death rate of children under 1 year per 1,000 births. It's still 40 children per 1,000 births are dying before they're 12 months in the 1930s. Over on the left-hand side, we look at death rate for women in childbirth per 1,000 births, 1875 to 1932. And the private hospital regulations come in 1909. But we don't see this decline in the same way that we have for the deaths of children. It's still jumping around and is really staying quite level, if you like. Between 5 and 6 women per 1,000 births die. I read an interesting thesis by Dr. Alan Hewison on obstetrics and gynecology, my apologies, gynecology, from the 50s to the turn of the century. And he believed that in fact the death rate of women in childbirth didn't go down until there was better blood grouping and better access to blood for transfusions, and of course post World War II antibiotics, and better attention paid to women's health during pregnancy, high blood pressure, that style of thing. And that's one of the reasons why births became more medical, if you like, and therefore moved out of the little private maternity hospital and into the public hospitals. So for most of us who were born in the 1950s onwards, we were born in public hospitals, whereas our cousins who were born in the 40s and the 30s and the 20s were more likely born at home or born at a private hospital. So Noeline has given me permission to put up her website. So if you're interested in what she's done, she also has information on midwives in the Sydney and Hawkesbury area from Leslie Potter on her website, and Teapot Genealogy can be contacted on their website as well. So what do I want you to remember? What do I want you to remember? Firstly, we do not have patient records for New South Wales private hospitals, and also private hospitals did not have to be licensed until late 1909 anyway. We hold the registers of the licenses from 1910 to 28 only, but not beyond that. Licensees and managers of private hospitals were registered from 1909 onwards in those registers, but nurses were only registered from 1926 after the Nurses Registration Act of 1924. Midwives who delivered babies in people's homes did not have to be registered until 1926. And also remember the importance of the legislation and the regulations and how they dictate, if you like, what records must be created and what records must be kept.